Welcome everyone. If you haven't been to one of my webinars before, my name is Erin Nicklin and I am a paediatric speech pathologist and the director of Each Speech Pear Plum Speech Pathology in Indooroopilly, Brisbane. Welcome. If it's your first time, welcome back if you've been to some of my talks before, and thank you as always to Little Wonders Montessori for hosting this session tonight. We're going to be talking all about pre-literacy and literacy development for little people, so usually around the ages of 0 to 6. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that I'm speaking to you from today, the Turrbal and Jagera peoples. I'm not very good at that pronunciation, so if anybody knows if I'm doing it wrong, please let me know. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I honour the powerful connection that the First Nations people hold to the land, community and language, the heart of communication and identity. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us this evening. So a little bit about myself before we start. So I'm Erin, paediatric speech pathologist and founder of Each Speech Pear Plum. I've worked in this field for 10 years now across schools, community clinics, hospitals, and now in my own private practice. I have a very special interest in early language development, speech sound disorders, early literacy, and supporting parents to feel confident and connected in their child's development. I also am a parent myself. I've got 2 young children who you'll see throughout this PowerPoint. They're very photogenic and they have lots of fun doing, photo shoots for the business, which is always very funny to watch. But I really do understand the juggle of having children and working and being concerned about what their development's like and making sure that they have the best of what they need. So whether you're here to learn something new, get reassurance or feel empowered, I hope the next hour supports you and your family and gives you a little bit more information about pre-literacy and literacy skills. So this is one of my favourite subjects, as I mentioned. It is a special interest of mine, early literacy, and how we can set children up for success right from the start. So here's what we're going to be covering tonight. First, we're going to be talking about what literacy actually is and when it really begins. And the spoiler is that it starts so much earlier than what people think, and it's more than just knowing the alphabet. So then we're going to explore how spoken language lays the foundation for reading and writing. This is the most powerful area where parents and early educators can make the biggest difference for our children and their literacy development. We'll also look at the 5 essential pre-literacy skills, so things like phonological awareness and vocabulary, and how they develop through everyday experiences, not anything special, just what we can do every day to support that. And then from there, we're going to walk you through some simple evidence-based strategies that you can use at home or in an early learning setting to support literacy in natural, playful ways. And I'll also share a quick update on the recent changes to literacy instruction, so how literacy is being taught in both here in Queensland and nationally. They're really encouraging changes, and they give us even more reason to invest in those early language skills as well. And then we're going to cover some signs that a child might need a little extra support and how speech pathology might be able to help them. Finally, we'll have time for questions, so write them down or pop them in the chat. If you want to put your camera on, I haven't asked people before, but it's always very strange talking to little symbols and letters. So if you want to pop your camera on, you're more than welcome to. And then you're also more than welcome to turn your microphone off at the end and ask questions too. So let's jump straight in. Before we get into all the content, we'll talk a little bit about what common terms we're going to use tonight. So at any point, if you're not sure, why don't you just take a quick photo or screenshot of these 2 tables I'll show you, just to help you follow along with some of the content. If I could use different words that weren't as big and easy to understand, I would, but there really isn't a substitute for some of these words. So we've got phonics, which is learning how letters match the sounds in words. Decoding, so sounding out words by breaking them down into their parts. Phonological awareness, so noticing and playing with the sounds in words, like rhyming or clapping out syllables. vocabulary, so the words that a child understands and uses. Fluency, reading smoothly without stopping to sound out every word. And comprehension, so understanding what we read and hear. We've also got receptive language, so a child's ability to understand words, sentences, and instructions that they hear. And we also have expressive language, so a child's ability to use words, sentences, and ideas to communicate with other people, so how we use our words. Syntax is the rules about how words are arranged in sentences, so word order and grammar, the ways we put everything together to make it make sense. Semantics is the meanings of words and sentences, knowing that a bat can mean an animal or a sports tool. And then pragmatics, so how we use language in social context. So turn taking in conversations, asking questions, using polite language, those types of things. So if you haven't already, take a quick screenshot because they will help later on. But now let's jump into what is literacy. So many people think of it as just reading and writing, but in reality, literacy begins long before a child ever opens a book or learns the alphabet. So it begins with talking, listening, thinking, and understanding right from birth. So it starts when a baby listens to your voice, or when a toddler points and names things, and when preschoolers play with rhyming words or tell you a story about their day. So they're all early literacy moments. To help explain how reading develops, we can look at a model called Scarborough's reading rope. It looks really complicated, and it's because it is. We need so many different skills to be able to develop literacy skills. So the rope is a powerful metaphor. It shows us that skilled reading is made up of two very tightly woven strands. So our first strand being language comprehension. It's about making meaning. So it includes our vocabulary, understanding sentence structure, using basic knowledge to connect ideas together, thinking and inferring or predicting. And then we've got word recognition. So it's about identifying the words on the page. So that includes phonological awareness, hearing sounds in words, decoding, becoming automatic with word reading. And as children grow, these strands become more fluent and more intertwined. So with enough instruction, enough real life practice and experience, they eventually become very skilled readers. So they're able to decode words accurately and understand what they mean simultaneously. What's important to know, though, is both strands are very essential. So if one is weak, the rope of reading becomes quite fragile. So while phonics and decoding and knowing the alphabet is really crucial, and we'll talk about those tonight as well, oral language, conversation, vocabulary, and rich experiences are just as important in the early years, almost more important at some point. So now that we've talked a little bit about what literacy is, we might have a look at where it all begins. So with language. So how does it lay the foundation for literacy to develop? So before a child can read a book or write a sentence, they need a strong foundation. So that's their ability to understand and use that spoken language that they've got. I think often we get very caught up in being able to recognize letters or write our letters. But if we don't have this ability to understand the language, our reading skills aren't going to be meaningful. So if we're looking at our broad skills, we've got our receptive language, so our understanding, and our expressive language, so how we use the words. So those are our two components of our 5 that we need. So we've also got our syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. So how we're putting our words together, something that we need for both writing and reading comprehension. Semantics, so knowing that things like run can mean something different in run fast and run a bath. That, yes, they're the same word, but they have different meaning in different contexts. And pragmatics, so it's the social side of language, knowing how to ask questions, knowing how to retell a story or take turns in a conversation. So when all of these elements are strong, children are better equipped to understand what they hear and read, express their ideas clearly, both orally and in written forms, connect the meaning of the story and instructions together. So really build meaning and understand what they've read. They can make inferences or guesses and predictions, which are skills that are crucial for comprehension as well. So this is why one of the most powerful things we can do in the early years is focus on our language skills. So through conversation, play, storytelling, and shared experiences. So the foundations of early literacy, the 5 essential pre-literacy skills that we need. So these are some of these skills. We call them pre-literacy skills because we need them before we can develop further in our literacy journey. They're just as important as learning letters and sounds, and they build the brain pathways for successful reading and writing further down the track. So our first one is oral language. As we've just been discussing, it's all about speaking and listening. When children tell stories and describe their day or ask questions, they're building their language skills that they'll later need to read and write. So it helps give them context to that written text. A child who can tell you what happened at the park is developing the same sequencing and sentence skills needed for writing a sentence when they're doing their schoolwork. Our second is vocabulary. So the more words a child hears and uses, the easier it is for them to understand what they're reading. So it's not just the number of words, it's also the variety. So instead of just saying big, we might say it's enormous or tiny or fragile or bouncy. So it really builds that meaning and lifts the words off the pages for them. So a great way to build vocabulary is to use descriptive words when you're playing. So we might say that dinosaur has jagged teeth, or that dinosaur has really sharp teeth. Or we might say, let's make a really tall, wobbly tower. So building in those really descriptive adjectives and verbs, and just making that vocabulary very broad. Our third is phonological awareness. So this sounds like a really big word, but it just means playing with the sounds in language. So not the letters yet, but the sounds. And if you take anything away from tonight's presentation, it's that I want you to think sounds, not letters. We want to emphasize those sounds as opposed to the print. So it can include things like rhyming. So cat and hat rhyme, cat, hat, bat. Often my own children will come to me and say, hey, mum, cat and bat, they rhyme. They're building that phonological awareness. Clapping the syllables. So if we have a big word like banana, we might say banana. If we're hearing the first sounds of a word, so what's the first sound we hear in sun? Sun starts with a S. These skills help children hear and manipulate sounds so that when they later learn letters, they already have a really strong base to match them to match the letters to the sounds. It also really helps them with their spelling skills later on as well, and learning to decode or break down a word. Our next is print awareness. So I know I said take away sounds. I would still say take away sounds, but we do need print awareness as well. So that's when a child's understanding that print has meaning, that these things on the page actually mean something. So it also extends though to knowing how to hold a book correctly, or recognizing that we read from left to right, and understanding that the words tell a story, not just the pictures. So a great way to build this is to point to the words that you read aloud, or to let your child turn the pages and read to you. So if I've got a book, I don't know if I've got a book on my desk today. I think I packed them all up. But if I've got a book and I'm holding that with my child, I might say, okay, we're going to read this book. Look, here's the title and this is the front. Let's turn the page. Turn this way, and I might read the story and show them with my finger that we're going left to right. So some really simple ways of that, essentially breaking down the anatomy of what a book is for them. And the fifth is motivation and engagement. So creating joyful, connected experiences with books is essential. A child who enjoys books, feels successful with their book experiences, and connects reading with comfort and fun and connection is far more likely to become a reader than a child who is not experiencing those joyful moments with a book. So it means it's okay to read the same book 100 times, over and over and over again. If we let our child read the story in their own way, that's another great way, right? They're reading to us. Or we can talk about the pictures instead of the exact text. So one of my favorite things to say is just read the pictures. Usually our children don't know if we're reading the story correctly or not, unless it's their favorite and they have read it 100 times, and they'll tell you exactly what word you've got wrong. But you can just read the pictures. So we really want to create a positive emotional connection to reading, because that's what will make children come back to it again and again and again, and it'll make them want to practice that reading. So when you play, you read, you chat, you sing with your child, you're building all of those 5 pillars that we've just talked about. So you don't need flashcards, you don't need worksheets. We just need joy and connection and a range of different experiences. So these experiences form the foundation that later bring on our reading skills. So our reading skills get built on these really strong foundations of language and connection, print awareness, and phonological awareness. So before we go any further, I do want to touch on bilingual children, because this is usually where I receive the most questions. And I'm going to say what I always say, which is growing up with more than one language is a strength, and it is an incredible gift that you can give your child. There's a really common concern that growing up with more than one language might confuse children or delay their ability to learn to speak, use language, communicate, and learn to read. But research shows us time and time again that bilingualism does not cause speech or language delays, or literacy delays. In fact, it often gives children an advantage in areas like vocabulary awareness, memory, and problem solving, really key skills for our children who are going to be developing literacy. So the key continues to be rich language exposure in any language. It does not discriminate. So reading books in your home language, telling stories, and having conversations all build the same foundations that support literacy in English. So please do not stop using your home language. Keep doing what you're doing. So I think I've just gone over this. Oral language skills in any language support later literacy. That's right. Okay. And it's okay if they mix languages while learning. They're building a really flexible brain. And if they've used, English for one word, but they've switched out their home language for another word, it still has the same context and the same meaning, and that's okay. They're just using what vocabulary they have available at the time. It's nothing to be concerned about. If somebody says to you, says something like only speak one language, or they're going to get confused, run away from them, please, because it is not true. I have people come and tell me that somebody said something along this line, and it's just not true. Rich language exposure in any language is of benefit to your child. Instead, support literacy in your home through songs, stories, and conversations in both languages. You can do it in both. It's a beautiful gift, and it keeps your child connected to your family and your culture and your history. So let's get into some of our changes that have happened recently in both our state and nation. There's been a lot of changes, especially here in Queensland, and it's the shift towards evidence-based literacy teaching in schools. It's really encouraging because we are using the evidence now. Previously, and I often think back to when I was taught how to read, it was not evidence-informed, even though we had the research then. But across Australia, we are now using version 9 of the Australian curriculum, which places far more emphasis on the core building blocks of reading. So that's our phonics, our oral language, phonological awareness, and our reading comprehension as well. So this curriculum update moves far away from the older strategies like 3 cueing, so where children were taught to guess words based on pictures or context. Instead, the focus is on helping children to learn to decode words accurately, using the sounds and letters that they see, not just the first sound or letter, which is what the research shows is most effective. So if I think back to when I was learning to read, I distinctly remember being told, look at the first letter, look at the last letter, look at the picture and take a guess. Now, I don't know about you, but even as an adult, if I did that now, that would be really challenging and really hard. So while this is still being taught in some schools, we now have our state and national government or federal government changing our curriculum. So children will be learning to read in an evidence-informed way. Now in Queensland, we also now have the Queensland Reading Commitment. So it rolled out in 2023 with a full implementation by 2025. So that means by the end of this year, every child from next year onwards should be being taught how to use with a structured, systematic approach. Every try and say that 5 times, it's really hard. So every single state school is expected to teach reading using a structured, systematic approach with phonics, vocabulary, and fluency at the heart of it. This is really exciting because it's setting up our children and their literacy beautifully. So what does this actually mean for your child, or what does it mean for you as a parent? Because everything you're doing at home, so you're talking, playing with sounds, building vocabulary, it's all complementary to what children are going to be learning at school if they're not already. So as of next year, this is what they will be learning, and it will be complementing that. It also means that early support, so whether that's from speech pathology or just reading together regularly, can give children a head start in the areas that school will now be prioritising. That's really exciting as well. So your child's already going to school with a lot of the knowledge that they need. So the big picture here is that we're going to see schools, families and therapists all pulling in the same direction. We're all going to be working towards the same goals, and that's really great news for our kids. That's less confusion for them and more cohesion between all the different pillars in the community. Many schools across Queensland and Australia are now using structured evidence-based literacy programs as part of their commitment to improved reading outcomes. So this is not an exhaustive list, it's just a list of very common ones. So you might hear terms like Sounds Right, Mini-Lit or Hegarty. These are all programs that follow a synthetic phonics model. When we talk about synthetic phonics, they need to have a sequence and structure. So that means, you know, in week 1, we learn X number of letter and sounds together. In week 2, we learn another new one. So it's very structured and staged and developmentally appropriate. So these programs are designed to be very explicit and systematic. So they're taught how to read in very clear step-by-step ways. If you're not sure what your school is using, it's okay to ask them. You might say what phonics or reading program is used here and how is it taught. I was being very particular when my son was looking at going to prep this year. He started this year, and I was being very overly speech mum, looking at what school teaches what in my area. So, and the one that they've ended up with has a completely different program to what I'd heard of before, but it is still synthetic and structured. But you might come across these. You'll often find that speech pathologists are trained in Sounds Right or Initial or Mini-Lit. They are some really great programs that we can use in a therapeutic way for children. So what can we do at home to support our little people and their early literacy development? So everyday moments build early literacy. So you're probably already doing a lot already. And that's always reassuring. I know it's reassuring for me. But what we can do, so we can narrate routines. So as you go through the day, you can talk about what's happening. You can say things like, now we're putting on your socks, or let's stir the noodles and pour in the sauce. It helps children learn sentence structure and new words and sequencing. So putting things in order. We can use a rich vocabulary. So instead of saying big, we could say huge or massive or giant. And instead of happy, we could say excited or thrilled. So really kind of looking more broadly at our vocabulary, using multiple different words. You don't need to worry if your child doesn't use those words right away. They're still learning them, and usually we need to hear them a few times before we can use them. They'll often pop up when you least expect it as well. I'm trying to think of a story of when my children have done that, but I'm pulling a blank, sorry. Songs and rhymes. So these are really powerful for language learning because they emphasize our rhythm and syllables and rhyme. They build memory and sequencing, and they create really joyful, connected learning moments. I find singing songs and making songs up on the spot and doing really silly rhyming words is a huge pull and draw card for children. So making up your own little songs about what you're doing, you're kind of ticking off that song play, but you're also ticking off narrating your routines, and it makes it a bit more fun. We can play with sounds. So you can try clapping out syllables and words like elephant, or you could do some rhyming words. Cat, hat, run. Which ones rhyme? Cat, hat. These games build that phonological awareness that we need as one of those 5 pillars. And it's one of our strongest predictors of future reading success as well. So we do have 3 predictors that we look at for reading success, and phonological awareness is one of them. I haven't gone into that today too much because that's kind of a bit, when we're in prep grade 1. But at the end, if anybody's interested, there will be time we can talk more about that. And read together every day. But don't feel pressure to get through a book. So I try and pair a book or reading a book with a monotonous routine that we're doing, where your kids like you to sit down and be with them. So for example, I'll sit down, we'll grab a couple books, they'll be in the bath, and I sit down and I do book reading while they're in the bath. My daughter likes to be read books while she's going to the toilet. That's totally different. And then also our bedtime routines too. Also find that breakfast in the morning when they're eating and they're sitting down, I can read a book as well. So kind of build it into what we're already doing. When we are doing booked story time, we try and let them turn the pages or talk about the pictures or ask open-ended questions like, what do you think will happen next? Oh, they're at the cave now. I wonder, do you think the bear's in the cave? What's going to happen next? And then finally, follow their interests. So if they're really big into trucks or bugs or dinosaurs, read about those. Go to the library. That's a really beautiful free activity. Pick out some books that are in that interest. A child who's engaged is much more likely to absorb the language and stay connected to reading than if we're reading books that we think are a good idea or we think are interesting. Whatever our child is interested in, we need to follow. So we can create a language-rich environment at home by following a few simple steps. So that might be limiting background noise, like the TV or radio during conversations. It might be making time for turn-taking conversations. So we always have our favorite question: what was your favorite thing that happened today? Or what's something that made you laugh today? And we all take turns talking about what's something that made us laugh today, or what was something that was a bit tricky today. So really encouraging that conversation where we all take a turn and we all answer the question. And letting your child lead and play interactions, lead and play in their interactions. So again, following their interest. If they're playing with a spoon and pretending it's a spaceship, go with it. I know we can find that really hard as an adult. And sometimes I find play hard because I just don't understand what they're trying to do, or, my imagination can't follow along with what they're saying. But if we follow their play and build language into it, they're going to be like, yeah, mum thinks I'm cool. And oh, that was a cool word. I'm going to use that next time. So really important. Another one is following their gaze and copying their sounds and words and actions. So, if they're looking at the dog in the book, name what they're seeing. Oh, you saw the dog. Oh, the dog, he's barking. This shows your child that their interests are really valid and encourages them to keep showing you and keep having turns with you. And then lastly, using open-ended materials like blocks and dolls and dress-ups. So these types of toys spark imagination and storytelling, which is really fantastic for oral language development. If we go back to what are some of those key foundations or core foundations, being able to tell stories. What I do want to touch on is you don't need anything crazy in terms of toys. It doesn't have to be the latest, I don't even know brands, doesn't have to be the latest thing, or it doesn't have to be fancy or flashcards. It can just be you. You know, you are the biggest toy in the room. And you can turn anything into play. So now we're going to go through when to seek extra support. I've done what I usually do, and even though it takes me an hour to get through this usually, I've sped through tonight, something about Monday nights. So you're not alone, and it's okay to seek help early if you're concerned. I think I say this in every webinar, trust your gut. If you need to talk to somebody to figure out if everything is going okay, then that's okay. You're not being over the top. You're not being paranoid. You need to listen to your gut. So a quick little refresher at what typical speech and language development looks like across the early years. So they're general guidelines. They're not checklists. You don't have to check everything off, but they can help you to kind of reflect on your child's current communication. So that let's kind of jump from about 12 to 18 months. So following simple instructions like give me the car or go get your shoes. They're saying about 5 to 20 words. They're copying sounds using and uses pointing and showing to communicate. And then there's speech sounds, so mostly vowels and excuse me, early consonants. At 18 to 24 months, so they're understanding 50 plus words and simple questions, and they're starting to put 2 words together. So more milk, mummy's shoe, and they're becoming more consistent and easier to understand. By 2 to 3 years, we really hope that they're understanding short stories and doing two-step instructions. So go get your shoes and bring them here. That's a connected 2-step instruction, but we would expect them to do that from now. And they're putting 3 and 4 words together, so making very simple sentences. They're naming objects and asking simple questions like, where's mum? By 3 to 4 years, they're understanding most everyday conversation, and they're using full sentences, and they can tell you a simple story, and they will start asking why. That's a really fun milestone when everything's why. Most people should understand them by this point. And then at 4 to 5 years, they should understand time words and longer instructions like before and after, today, tomorrow, yesterday, and tell full stories using future and past tense and using imagination. And they are understood by almost everyone. So just a little refresher of what we're expecting to see. So signs that your child may benefit from seeing a speech pathologist or getting a little bit of extra support. So speech is hard, if speech is hard to understand for other people, even for familiar people, so that's usually a red flag. I will, and it's not to alarm people, but if your child is very unintelligible, please go and seek help from a speech pathologist to identify if that's age appropriate or not. Our children with speech delays or speech sound disorders are at a greater risk of developing literacy delays because it is harder for them to apply their knowledge and read the words off the page. So, if they're saying, instead of saying sun, they might be saying done. They might represent that S as a D sound. So it's going to really impact their reading and their spelling later on. So they're not yet using sentences expected for their age. So for example, they're not putting 2 to 3 words together by the age of 2.5, or not using small sentences by ages 3 to 4. If that's happening, we'd really like to be able to support them. Having trouble with rhyming games or clapping syllables or hearing the first sounds in words. Now that's not for little people, that's for, our 5-year-olds, so 5, 6 years old. If that's getting really challenging for them, they've had 2, 3 terms at prep and that's still hard for them, then it's definitely worth seeking some additional support. If we're thinking about a 3-year-old just getting exposed, please do not panic. 3-year-olds will have a hard time with that. And then they seem unsure when naming letters, or they can't yet recognize familiar letters in their name. So usually kids will recognize their name as one of the first things that they put meaning to with print. If they still can't recognize those individual letters, point out and say, oh, look, there's an E. E's for Erin. That's in my name. Then we might want to look a bit further. If your child loves books and they're really eager to learn, but they still really struggle to connect letters and sounds, that's worth exploring as well. So all of these things are areas that speech pathologists can help with. And the good news is that early help really works. I know I say that all the time as well, but it reduces frustration for the child and for the parent. Behind early feeding and fussy eating, I find parents have almost a harder time with literacy and supporting their child to learn how to read. It's a really challenging skill, and we need to have patience to support them, but I think we all find that we can find that really challenging at times. But we can set kids up for success and confidence if we're giving them the right supports. And I always say, if you're wondering whether you should check in, it's probably worth checking in. There's no harm in a conversation, and often just a few small tweaks or strategies can make a really big difference. It's not because you're doing anything wrong. It's just your child needs something a little bit different, and it's my job to figure that out for you, not yours. So I'm going to wrap up there, which means we've got a little bit of time for questions. But before we do, I wanted to show you some of these great resources or websites that you can go to, particularly the Sounds Right Parent Training. It's a free course, and it's a really lovely evidence-informed course and and really helps us as parents to understand how we can support our children with their reading and spelling. I'm a huge advocate for the Sounds Right program. I'm trained in it. I use it in intervention all the time for children, and I just think the way they present information is really easy to understand. But there are other places we can go to as well. So Speech Pathology Australia, they have their communication milestones as always. You can access that on their website. Talking Point UK is a site for parents, and they've got lots of practical tips for developing communication and early literacy as well. There's the Hannon Centre, so they do lots of parent tips. They've got book lists and lots of strategies for building language through play and reading. I'm also trained in those approaches, and I think they're beautiful. And the National Centre on Improving Literacy, so that's US-based. It's research-backed strategies, and they've got free downloadable tools as well. If your child is in prep and they are reading, there are plenty of online resources that are free. So if you Google free decodable text Australia, you should be able to find a lot of free decodable books that you can print out, or you can just read on the computer. When we say decodable, it means that a child can say each sound. So each letter represents a single sound, and that's in those early initial type phases. I guess that's probably the best way to describe it. And we've got some time, so I can always jump onto Google and show you what I mean as well. So thank you for joining us. As I always say, please send your feedback in. I think my next topic I'm thinking about changing. So if there's something you'd really like to hear from me about, then please send that through in your feedback. I want these to be really meaningful for you, not just for what I think you want. And then if you want, you can join our newsletter. I've been pretty slack on that, to be honest, but that will be coming back up soon. And then any questions, put them in the chat and we can answer those. Okay, so we've got, let's move this so I can see it. So Sounds Right is what I was talking about. So this is their website. It's a UK-based company, but they have got some training. See where resources, parents and carers. They also have a great podcast, which is excellent to read, and they've now got an iPad app, which is great. So this is the course, Help Your Child to Read and Write. So it's a free course for parents and carers that help you really figure out how to support that reading and writing. So how they can build, write and read simple consonant, vowel, consonant words, understand how to correct your child when they make a mistake in their reading or writing of simple words, and a very basic understanding of how phonics works. So it's a really great foundational sort of course to do as a parent, because I think, you know, if we think about the way that most of us were taught to read, it's very different now. And even knowing how to correct your child when they make a mistake in their reading can be really helpful. I know my model from when I was younger, it's just not the way that you should be taught. I remember my parents being very, very cross and very impatient with me, just saying, look at the first letter, look at the picture, take a guess, which is not how we do it. So that's that one. They also have some free resources as well. So we can take a look. They've got a screening check. That's more for professionals, but where are they? Here we go. So they've got a free initial code first step ebook collection. So that's the books that they have that are decodable. If we take a look at free decodable readers, I think it's spelled. Yeah, spelled SA, I think. They often have free readers. And they are in that sounds right. So we can go ahead and we can download them from there. So Tim Sat, this one's in our first unit of, I think it's following the sounds right initial code, but we can go down and we've now got the story. Sit Tim, and this is very age appropriate for our preppies. Tim Sat, it is Sam, Sam, sit Sam. So lots of repetition and practice with those ones, but Spelled South Australia is a great resource as well. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining. I think my next one's in a month, but please send your feedback through if there's anything you'd really like to learn about, because as I said, I want them to be meaningful for the people attending, not just what I think you want to hear about.